It was the second Monday of October, which meant Thanksgiving in Canada, and my son had just carved the turkey I bought, at the table I built with my own hands 30 years ago, in the house I've owned since before he was born. I remember thinking the gravy smelled exactly the way his mother used to make it. That was the last peaceful thought I had that evening. I'm telling you this from a small apartment in Halifax, Nova Scotia, with a cup of tea going cold beside me and the Atlantic wind doing what it always does to the windows here. I moved here 4 months ago. My son doesn't know my address. That was a choice I made deliberately, and I want to explain why. Because the full story matters. The ending doesn't make sense without the beginning. My name is Gerald. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a licensed electrician in Hamilton, Ontario, worked my way up to running my own small crew, and retired 2 years ago with a reasonable RRSP, a paid-off house in Ancaster, and what I believed was a close relationship with my only child. My wife Patricia passed away 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by September. She was the kind of woman who made every room feel intentional. After she died, the house in Ancaster felt about 3 times its actual size. My son, Ryan, was 29 at the time. He and his wife, Melissa, were renting a condo in Burlington. I told Ryan to take as much time as he needed. He told me he was fine. He wasn't fine, but neither was I. And we didn't talk about it the way we should have. About 8 months after Patricia died, Ryan called to tell me he'd been laid off from his logistics coordinator job. The company downsized. He sounded embarrassed about it, which I understood. He's always been proud, the way young men are when they've worked hard to prove something. Melissa was working as a dental hygienist. Their rent was just over $2,200 a month. I knew the numbers weren't comfortable. I offered without hesitating. Come stay with me. The house is too big for one person. Save your money. Get back on your feet. Take the time you need. They moved in 3 weeks later. I want to be honest about this part because I think it matters for everything that follows. Those first several months were genuinely good. Ryan helped around the house. Melissa cooked 2 or 3 times a week. We watched the Leafs lose together, which is a particular Canadian bonding experience that I think brings families closer through shared suffering. There was something that almost felt like the house being full again. I covered all the utilities. Groceries were mine. I paid the property taxes on time as I always had. Kept up with the maintenance. And I didn't once bring up the subject of rent or contribution, because that wasn't why I'd invited them. I had more than enough from my pension and my RRSP withdrawals. Patricia had been frugal her whole life, and so had I. And between the two of us, we'd built something solid. I didn't need their money. What I didn't see clearly, not for a long time, was the shape of what was developing. Ryan found work again about 14 months in, a supply chain role with a company in Mississauga. Good salary, benefits, the kind of position he'd been aiming for. Melissa got a raise around the same time. By any reasonable measure, they were doing well. 2 incomes, no rent, no utility bills, no grocery costs. I genuinely thought this was the moment things would shift. I thought they'd start talking about their own place. Instead, they got a new truck. A leased F-150 with the trim package, close to $900 a month. Then a trip to Portugal in the spring. Then new furniture for the bedroom they were using, which they ordered without asking and had delivered on a Tuesday afternoon while I was out. None of these things were my business, technically. They were adults. But I noticed that the savings I assumed they were building didn't seem to be materializing. And when I gently mentioned, once, that the housing market in the Hamilton area had cooled slightly from its peak and that it might be worth looking, Melissa smiled and said they were comfortable where they were. That word, comfortable. It started small. The shift in how they spoke to me. Melissa stopped including me in conversations about plans for the weekend. Ryan started answering my questions with the particular short patience you use on someone you consider an interruption. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself I was still adjusting to retirement, still finding my footing without the structure of work, still missing Patricia more than I ever said out loud. I was 63 years old, in good health, with a full life behind me, and I hoped a reasonable amount of it still ahead. I volunteered on Tuesday mornings at a food bank in Dundas. I was rebuilding a 1974 Triumph motorcycle in the garage that had belonged to my father. I had friends. I read. I was not, by any honest measure, a man without purpose or direction. I don't think Ryan saw any of that. About 2 years into their stay, Melissa sat down with me at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning and told me that she and Ryan had been thinking seriously about their future. She said it the way someone says it when they've rehearsed it. She said the house was beautiful and they appreciated everything, but they needed to think about stability, about ownership, about raising a family. She said they'd been looking at the market. I told her that was wonderful. I meant it. I asked where they'd been looking. She said they'd actually been wondering whether I'd considered putting the house in Ryan's name. I sat with that for a moment. The house in Ancaster is worth somewhere between $850,000 and $920,000, depending on the day and who you ask. I bought it in 1991 for $212,000. Patricia and I paid off the mortgage in 2009. It is the single largest asset I have, and it is where I intended to live for the rest of my life, or at least until I chose otherwise. I told Melissa that I hadn't considered that, no. I kept my voice even. She said she understood, of course, no pressure. They just wanted to plant the seed. I went out to the garage after and stood next to the Triumph for about 20 minutes without touching it. The following weeks had a texture I can only describe as altered. I was still in my own home, but something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. Ryan seemed to know the conversation had happened, and he didn't bring it up, which told me he'd known it was coming. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before, and what I saw when I paid attention was that the easy warmth from the early days was gone. Not dramatically. Not cruelly. Just gone. The way heat leaves a room slowly until you realize you've been cold for a while. I made a decision in November. I called my accountant, a man named Paul whom I've trusted for 20 years, and I told him I wanted to look seriously at my financial picture. Not because I was panicking, because I believed in being clear-eyed about things. What Paul helped me understand was that the house was not only my home. It was, practically speaking, my primary financial instrument in retirement. If I signed it over, or sold it and distributed the proceeds, I would be dependent on my RRSP and CPP alone, which was manageable, but not what I'd planned, and more to the point, I would no longer have the thing I'd spent 31 years working toward. I would be, at 63, without the floor I'd built. I also asked Paul, while we were talking, about trusts. He explained how a family trust works, how assets can be directed, how you can specify beneficiaries with conditions attached. He gave me the name of an estate lawyer named Catherine. I wrote her number down and put it in my wallet and didn't call her yet. But I kept the number. Thanksgiving arrived the way it always does in Ontario, with that particular quality of October light that makes everything look like it's already being remembered rather than actually happening. I bought the turkey. I made my mother's stuffing, the one with sage and dried cranberries that Ryan used to ask for specifically every year when he was a boy. Melissa made a salad, and something with sweet potato that I don't think she'd made before. We sat down at the table I built, and for a little while it was almost like the early days again, almost like family. Ryan poured the wine. We talked about his work for a while. I asked about Melissa's clinic. She was telling me about a patient who'd been coming in since she was a student when Ryan interrupted her, gently, and said there was something they'd wanted to talk to me about. I had the strange sensation of already knowing what was coming, the way you know a sound is going to be loud a half second before it is. Ryan said that he and Melissa had been doing a lot of thinking. He said they were grateful for everything. He said that sincerely, I believe. He said they were at a stage in their lives where they needed to move forward. He said the house was really more space than one person needed, meaning me. He said that they'd looked at the numbers and buying in the current market was, he used the word brutal. He said between their line of credit and the truck and some credit card debt that had accumulated during the period when he was between jobs, saving a real down payment was taking longer than they'd hoped. I asked, quietly, what exactly he was proposing. He said they thought the most sensible thing would be for me to transfer the house to him, formally, and I could continue living there in the short term while I figured out my next step. He said he and Melissa had talked to someone, I assumed a real estate lawyer, about how this could be structured. I put my fork down. I asked Ryan what line of credit he was referring to. He said they had a home equity line of credit they'd taken out, using his previous condo as collateral before they'd given up the lease. He said it was around $46,000. He said the credit cards were another 18 or so. He said these things happen when you're young and building, that I wouldn't understand because my generation had easier access to affordable housing. I want to stop here for a moment and be honest about the feeling that moved through me when he said that. Because it wasn't anger, not at first. It was something slower and sadder than anger. It was the feeling of looking clearly at a person you love and realizing that the version of that person you'd been carrying in your mind bore very little resemblance to who they actually were. Two people with professional incomes, living for over 2 years without a single household expense, had accumulated $64,000 in debt. Not through crisis, not through illness or job loss or genuine hardship, through a truck they couldn't afford, and a vacation, and the ordinary financial carelessness of people who believed a safety net would always be there. And the safety net they believed in was me. I told Ryan I needed to think about this. I stood up from the table, very calmly, picked up my plate, set it in the kitchen, and went to the garage. I sat next to the Triumph in the dark for a long time. The conversation that ended everything happened 3 weeks later. It was a Wednesday evening. Ryan had come home from work. Melissa was at her book club, and I was in the living room reading when he came in and sat down across from me with the look of a man who had decided that a direct approach was more efficient than patience. He asked if I'd thought any more about what they'd discussed. I told him I had. I told him I'd spoken to my accountant and my lawyer. I told him I was prepared to offer them $40,000 from my RRSP, which was a real and significant amount, and that this was money they could use toward a proper down payment on a property that would be theirs. He looked at the number the way someone looks at an answer that's technically correct but to a question they weren't asking. He said $40,000 in the GTA housing market was not enough to change their situation meaningfully. I said I understood that, and that it was what I was in a position to offer. Then he said something, and I want to be precise here because the exact words matter. He said, "Dad, you're retired. You don't work anymore. What do you actually contribute? What's the point of you just sitting here in this house that could actually solve our problem?" I have been asked many questions in my 64 years. I have been challenged and criticized and disagreed with. I have had arguments in my marriage and at work and with friends and with strangers. I have heard things that hurt before. I don't think anything had ever landed quite that way. What's the point of you? He wasn't being cruel in the theatrical sense. He wasn't yelling. He was being matter of fact, which was almost worse, because it meant he'd considered the question and arrived at an answer, and the answer was that I didn't have one, that whatever I was, and whatever I'd done and built and given, had concluded. And what remained? I looked at my son for a long moment. I said, "All right. Let me think." He nodded, as though we'd reached an agreement, and went to the kitchen to make himself something to eat. I picked up my book. I didn't read a single word for the rest of the evening, but I sat there quietly, and I looked at the room around me, and I made up my mind. I called Catherine, the estate lawyer, the next morning. What followed over the next 6 weeks was the most methodical and deliberate period of my life. I want to be clear that none of it came from bitterness, though I understand why it might look that way. It came from clarity. The same clarity that tells a good electrician exactly which wire goes where, and why getting it wrong has consequences. Catherine helped me establish a discretionary family trust. The terms were specific. The beneficiaries were any biological or legally adopted grandchildren I might have. Not Ryan. Not Melissa. The house, when sold, along with a portion of my liquid assets, would flow into that trust. If Ryan and Melissa had children, those children would receive the benefit of what I'd built. If they didn't, or if Ryan chose to sever contact, the trust would convert to a named charitable beneficiary, an organization in Hamilton that runs trades training programs for young people without financial support, something Patricia would have approved of. I listed the house with an agent I trusted, a woman who had sold it to me originally and was still, improbably, in the business. We agreed on a quiet listing, no sign on the lawn, showings by appointment only. She brought a buyer within 9 days, a young family from Waterloo. They made a strong offer. I accepted. I booked a flight to Halifax one way. My old friend from my apprenticeship days, a man I'll call Don because that's actually his name, had been living there since his own retirement and had been saying for 2 years that I should come see what the East Coast felt like. I'd been saying I would. It was time to actually mean it. I booked a furnished apartment online, month to month near the water. I did not tell Ryan any of this. The closing date on the house was set for the 3rd week of February. I planned to be on a plane before that morning. The night before I left, I packed 2 bags. Everything that mattered personally, which turned out to be less than I expected. Patricia's photograph, my father's watch, the small box of things from my mother's kitchen, a wooden spoon and a recipe card in her handwriting for Christmas shortbread. My tools I arranged to have shipped later. The Triumph I sold to a man in Stony Creek who'd been asking about it for a year. I told him to restore it right. Ryan and Melissa were at her parents' place in Oakville for the weekend. They'd told me Friday evening they'd be back Sunday. I knew I'd be gone by then. I left an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside the envelope were 3 things. The first was a letter. Not a long one because I'm not a man who performs emotions on paper. I wrote that I loved my son and that I always would. That none of what I was doing was the act of a man who stopped loving his child. I wrote that I was 64 years old and I was not ready to dissolve. And that when he'd ask what the point of me was, he had done me the favor of making something very clear that I'd been slow to see. I wrote that the house was sold, the closing date was on the documents attached, and that Ryan and Melissa needed to make other arrangements before the 3rd week of February. I told him I had informed them of this legally through Catherine's office as well, so there would be no confusion. The second thing was a copy of the trust documents, with Catherine's contact information. I wrote a note in the margin in my own handwriting. It said, "This is not punishment. It is what I built. Directed toward what I hope is still possible." The third thing was a letter I'd written separately, sealed inside a smaller envelope, with the words, "Open this together," written on the outside. Inside that smaller envelope, I'd written to both of them, not with anger but with honesty, about what I believed a family owed one another and what it did not owe. I wrote that I had been a roof and a floor and a resource for 2.5 years without complaint and without condition, and that I had found the experience meaningful because I believed I was helping people I loved build something. I wrote that what had shifted was not the helping but the understanding of what I was to them while I helped. A resource is not a person. I told them I hoped they would have children because I believed parenthood might teach Ryan what no other experience could. I told them I had arranged for a portion of my assets to go into trust for those grandchildren, should they arrive, and that what I'd built would reach the next generation, even if it didn't pass through Ryan's hands directly. I told them this was not cruelty. It was the architecture of love. When love has to work without proximity. I signed it. Dad. Who has a point? I left before sunrise. I drove my car to the airport, returned it to the rental lot, and boarded a 6:15 a.m. and flight to Halifax with the window seat. I'd specifically chosen because I knew the approach comes in over the water, and Patricia and I had talked once about seeing the Atlantic coast together and never got there. Don was waiting at the arrivals area with a Tim Hortons large double-double and the expression of a man who has been waiting for a friend to make a long overdue decision. He drove me to the apartment. We sat and watched the harbor for a while without talking much, which is the best kind of conversation. That was 4 months ago. The house closed on schedule. Catherine confirmed everything went through without issue. The buyers, that young family from Waterloo, sent a short email through the agent saying they loved the kitchen and had already made the stuffing recipe I'd left, tucked inside the cabinet above the stove. I don't know why I'd left it there, force of habit maybe. but I was glad they found it. Ryan called the day after the closing. Then 3 more times over the following week. I let them go. To voicemail. He left messages that moved. Over those calls. From confused, to frustrated, to something that might have been the beginning of understanding. I didn't call back. Not because I was punishing him, because I had said what I needed to say in the letter. And I knew that anything said on the phone in those first weeks would be reactive and noisy, and wouldn't serve either of us. About 6 weeks after I arrived in Halifax, I sent Ryan one text message. It said, "I'm well. I hope you are too. When you're ready to talk properly, I'm here. I love you." He read it immediately. The little check mark went blue. He didn't respond for 11 days. Then he sent back, "I'm sorry, Dad. I think I need more time to understand this. But I'm sorry." I read that message twice. Then I put my phone in my pocket and went for a walk along the waterfront, past the old buildings and the boats and a group of teenagers arguing happily about something I couldn't quite make out. The wind came off the water the way it always does here. Cold and direct, and entirely without pretense. I thought about Patricia the way I do most days. I thought about what she would have said about all of this. I think she would have been sorrier about it than I am, because she always held more hope for reconciliation than I've been able to manage. But I also think she would have understood the envelope. She was a practical woman. She knew that love without self-respect isn't love, it's just availability. I volunteer now at a community workshop in the north end of Halifax that teaches young tradespeople basic electrical and carpentry skills. I go on Tuesdays and Thursdays. There's a kid there, 17, named Olivier, who is going to be an exceptional electrician if somebody gives him the right foundation. I find I have opinions about that. Don and I have a standing Friday arrangement involving cribbage and a rye whiskey he orders from a small distillery in Cape Breton that I'm embarrassed to admit I've grown dependent on. I have a library card. I found a mechanic here who doesn't flinch when I describe unusual problems with vintage motorcycles, which gives me hope about eventually finding another project. It is not the life I had planned. Patricia was supposed to be in it. Ryan was supposed to be in it differently. Plans are the things you make before the weather changes. But I wake up in the morning in a place I chose, doing things I chose, and when I look at the harbor from my window, I don't feel the particular heaviness that had been sitting in my chest for the last 2 years of living in that house, being useful in the way an ATM is useful. Present in the way a filing cabinet is present. Ryan sent another message last week. He said he and Melissa had found a 1-bedroom apartment in Hamilton while they looked for something more permanent. He said the line of credit was down to $30,000. He said it matter-of-factly, without asking me to respond to it, which I took as a sign that he was beginning to understand something about dignity. I wrote back and told him that was good to hear. I meant it. I don't know how this ends between my son and me. I know that I love him the way I have loved him since the afternoon. They put him in my arms at the hospital, and Patricia looked at me over his head and said, "Well, here we are then. That kind of love doesn't require you to disappear. But it doesn't require you to be a floor that someone stands on without noticing either." I am 64 years old. I have a point. I have always had one. It just took me too long to say so, and a question asked at a Thanksgiving table for me to finally mean it. The tea beside me has gone completely cold, which is something I should have anticipated and didn't, which is perhaps a metaphor for something, though I've never been much for metaphors. I'll make another cup. Halifax evenings take their time, and I've learned to let them.